The dining room felt unfamiliar without Dorian's steady presence. The oak table that had been the center of so many family gatherings now appeared oversized and hollow, even with the three of us gathered around it. I kept stealing glances at his vacant chair, half hoping to catch a glimpse of him there with his warm grin and soothing demeanor. It had been precisely 1 week since we laid my husband of 32 years to rest. 1 week since I'd stood by his graveside feeling as though a piece of my spirit had been torn from me. The sorrow still weighed heavily on my heart, turning every inhale into an effort. "Hand me the greens," Camilla said, her tone sharp enough to slice through steel. My daughter-in-law had never spoken to me with any real kindness, but that evening an unfamiliar coldness drifted through the room. When I reached for the serving dish, my hands trembled slightly, remnants of the day's wait. The memorial had drained me far more than I'd expected. At 68, I thought I was emotionally prepared. I wasn't. Nothing could dull the aching emptiness that lingered like a shadow. Lamont, my 43-year-old son, planted himself between us as if he were presiding over a decision already made. He hadn't spared me more than a passing glance all night. Every bit of his attention was locked on his wife of 15 years. The child who once curled into my lap during the storms now couldn't even meet my eyes. "The service was beautiful, don't you think?" I offered, trying to smooth the stiff silence. "Your father would have been touched by how many people came." Camilla set her fork down with a deliberate, practiced grace. "Yes, well, that's exactly what we need to discuss with you, Latrice." Her tone carried a heaviness that knotted my stomach. I glanced between her and Lamont, searching for a flicker of warmth, the kind of empathy families are supposed to have when grief is shared. All I found was cold calculation in her gaze and uneasy avoidance in my son's. "What are you trying to say, say?" I asked, though some part of me already braced for the worst. Camilla straightened in her chair, assuming the posture she used whenever she was about to lay down terms. I'd witnessed it previously, typically when she was justifying why Lamont couldn't drop by as much, or why our family customs had to shift to suit her whims. "Lamont and I have been discussing this," she started, her words laced with that phony sweetness she deployed when pursuing her goals. "Now that Dorian has passed, this house will be overwhelming for you to manage by yourself." I blinked, bewildered. "Overwhelming? I've been tending to this home for more than 30 years. I know every groaning step and finicky pipe." "Yes, that's the issue," Camilla pressed on, her veneer of politeness fading a touch. "You're not as young as you used to be, and upkeep on a place this big costs a fortune. Lamont and I believe it would be wiser for you to relocate somewhere more appropriate." The suggestion struck me like a slap. "Relocate? This is my sanctuary. Dorian and I forged our existence here. Lamont was raised in these walls." Lamont finally chimed in, his words little more than a murmur. "Mama, Camilla's got a point. The maintenance alone will bury you." "I'm not incapable, Lamont," I replied, my voice wavering just a bit. "And this house, your father and I scrimped for ages to purchase it. Every corner is filled with echoes of our shared life." Camilla's face tightened. "Echoes don't cover electric bills or property fees. Get real, Latrice." I gazed at her, this lady who'd methodically edged me from my son's world over 15 years. The one who'd persuaded Lamont that weekly meals with his mother were too demanding and that holiday time needed equal division, which invariably tilted toward her kin. "What precisely are you proposing?" I asked, even as a chill settled in my gut like frost. "We suggest you consider one of those pleasant retirement villages," Camilla stated, her manner implying she was granting me a huge boon. "A spot with programs and folks in your age group. It'd be far superior to you wandering alone in this vast vacant space." I pivoted to Lamont, clinging to hope for some indication he opposed this scheme. "Lamont, you truly think I ought to sell the home where you were brought up? Where your father and I—" "It adds up, Mama," he cut in, eyes averted. "And truthfully, Camilla and I could make good use of the room. We've been considering growing our family, and this place offers so much room to work with." The implication washed over me like an icy tide. They weren't merely pushing me aside, they coveted my home. The one Dorian and I had tenderly refurbished section by section across 3 decades. "Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back," Camilla's voice abruptly shed all facade of courtesy. "The house was never really yours anyway." The Swahili term for father-in-law slipped from her lips with effortless disdain, as if she were debating tossing out outdated decor rather than evicting her husband's mother. Lamont glanced up then, and for an instant, I spotted a flash in his eyes, doubt, perhaps even remorse. But then he grinned and bobbed his head. She's correct, Mama. This house belonged to Dad, and now it's mine. You were simply staying here. My reality spun wildly. Simply staying here, as if 32 years of wedlock, of crafting a life and nurturing a child, equated to nothing beyond prolonged tenancy. I understand, I murmured, my tone firmer than my inner turmoil. Within, something fractured, not solely my heart, but my grasp of who my son truly was, who my kin were. I rose gradually, my limbs unsteady. I'll require some time to— 2 weeks, Camilla interjected. That ought to suffice for locating a fitting spot and hiring packers. 2 weeks? Not 2 months, not a sensible period to mourn and organize. 2 weeks to unravel a lifetime. Lamont at last met my eyes directly, and what I beheld there was more painful than fury or spite. It was apathy, utter, nonchalant apathy toward my suffering. It's for your own good, Mama, he uttered, as though reassuring himself alongside me. You'll come around. I ascended the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Dorian. Each footfall felt like scaling a peak. The space still carried his aftershave scent, and his bifocals rested on the bedside table where he'd placed them the evening prior to his stroke. I perched on the bed's edge and gazed at my image in the vanity mirror. The woman staring back appeared beyond her 68 years, her coiled gray hair flat and her deep brown eyes muted by astonishment and loss, her ebony skin etched with fresh lines of worry. In 2 weeks, I'd have to abandon this chamber where I'd bid farewell to Dorian merely 7 days earlier. I'd need to box up 32 years of partnership and yield it all to a son who'd just declared I'd never truly fit in anyway. But as I lingered there in the deepening shadows, another sensation stirred beneath the mourning and dismay, a tiny, resolute spark of resolve. Dorian had always overseen our money matters, but he'd schooled me to be diligent, to notice the finer points. Tomorrow I'd begin preparations. I'd visit the bank and commence unraveling precisely what belonged to me. Because if Lamont and Camilla believed they could simply wipe me from this lineage without repercussions, they could be due for a shock. The initial step was grasping exactly what Dorian had bequeathed and to whom. The morning light streamed differently through the kitchen panes as I sat solitary at the breakfast nook, savoring my second mug of tea. 10 days had elapsed since that dreadful supper, and the home seemed to hold its breath, anticipating my departure. Lamont and Camilla had stopped by twice already to survey the layout, gauging spaces and debating remodels as if I were a ghost. The day before, I'd caught Camilla on a call with a builder, booking quotes for once the old lady clears out. I'd passed those 10 days in an odd haze of detachment, methodically organizing possessions and attempting to suppress the mounting knot of unease in my belly. But that morning, I finally felt equipped to confront the pragmatic tasks Dorian would have anticipated me to tackle. The journey to Central Union Bank lasted 15 minutes along the well-known avenues of our community. I traversed this path for over 20 years, often with Dorian beside me managing our banking while I remained in the vehicle. He'd always shielded our finances, not from distrust, but because he claimed it was one fewer burden for me. Now I regretted not being more involved. In Washington, the branch director welcomed me with the measured compassion set aside for fresh widows. Miss Monroe, I was heartbroken to learn about Dorian. He was such a refined soul, always inquiring after my kids. Thank you, Renee. He mentioned you warmly as well. I eased into the seat opposite her workstation, my handbag gripped firmly in my grasp. I need to clarify my financial standing. Dorian managed it all, and I'm somewhat adrift. Renee's face softened with empathy. Certainly, let me access your profiles. She pivoted to her monitor, keys tapping swiftly. After a beat, her brows lifted a fraction. Oh dear, is there an issue? My pulse quickened. Had Lamont and Camilla somehow tapped into our funds already? Not an issue per se, it's simply that there are numerous accounts listed beyond what I anticipated. Renee's tone carried surprise. Let me begin with the shared checking you and Dorian utilized for daily costs. She outputted a report and passed it over. The total was reasonable but sufficient to manage my outlays for months if prudent. Relief surged within me. At minimum, I wouldn't be penniless. Now, Renee proceeded, there's a joint savings too. Another document materialized. This sum was notably bigger, ample to support me for years if required. That's a blessing, I remarked, some strain easing from my frame. Dorian was ever vigilant about reserves. Yes, he was quite systematic, Renee concurred, yet she still furrowed her brow at the display. Ms. Monroe, I'm noting several additional accounts that require confirmation. Some are solely in your name. When did you last examine your full financial holdings with Dorian? In my name alone, Bayo, I repeated, puzzled. That can't be accurate. Dorian oversaw all our money. Renee's digits danced across the keys once more. Per our logs, there are 4 extra ones, 2 certificates of deposit, a high-yield savings, and, this is notable, a revocable trust set up 5 years back. My thoughts whirled. I don't comprehend. Dorian never breathed a word of this to me. Might I inquire, did your husband ever voice worries about your household dynamics? Occasionally, clients create isolated accounts for safeguarding. The query startled me. Safeguarding from what? I'm unclear on your implication. Renee paused, selecting her phrasing with care. At times, when clients face intricate family situations, maybe fears of estate conflicts or outside influences, they implement measures to secure their partner's economic stability. I reflected on Dorian's conduct in recent years, how he'd begun posing direct queries about Camila's extravagant ways, how he'd fallen silent whenever Lamont referenced their money woes, how he'd demanded to manage all banking solo, never permitting Lamont to tag along even when our son proposed it. Can you detail these other accounts? I requested, my voice hushed. Renee generated more sheets. The initial CD has renewed yearly for 7 years. The second began 3 years prior. The high-yield savings has drawn automatic pulls from your shared checking. Minor sums, $50 sporadically, but cumulatively. She extended the reports. The figures blurred before me. These weren't trivial safety nets. These were considerable sums sufficient to acquire property, to thrive easily for ages. How could this be? I queried. I never authorized anything. Actually, you did, Renee explained softly, retrieving a dossier. Your endorsements are on every form. It seems Dorian escorted you in to sign, likely framing them as standard updates or policy adjustments. I examined the documents she presented. There was my mark, dated and attested on papers I couldn't recall, but eyeing the timelines, I could situate a few. The occasion we'd updated our contact after the street renumbering. The instance we'd transitioned to a fresh checking format. He never disclosed what I was truly endorsing, I breathed. It's not rare, Renee noted delicately. Certain partners opt to manage specifics to spare anxiety or muddle, and lawfully, all is proper. These are rightfully yours. I struggled to absorb the ramifications. While Lamont and Camila were sizing up my cooking area and scheming their upgrades, while they regarded me as a load to discard, I possessed assets they were oblivious to. There's one additional item, Renee added, her tone more guarded. The trust I referenced, it's been accumulating shifts from a corporate account over 5 years, the Monroe Building Trust. I think that was your husband's firm. Yes, but Dorian disposed of the enterprise upon retiring. Lamont claimed the proceeds scarcely cleared obligations. Renee checked her monitor anew. By our data, the corporate account remains operational. Regular inflows then moves to your trust. Ms. Monroe, I suggest consulting the firm's bookkeeper. Your financial landscape might be broader than you know. I departed the bank in a fog, my bag laden with summaries and outputs. Rather than heading directly home, I veered into a quaint diner's lot and idled in my car, poring over Renee's provisions. The digits were undeniable. Somehow, unbeknownst to me, Dorian had been diligently shielding me. Each profile, each placement, each trust was designed to guarantee my fiscal autonomy. As I scrutinized the trust logs, a rhythm surfaced. The inflows aligned with Lamont's drop-ins over 5 years, always heftier after he'd solicited his dad for minor advances, or when Camila had alluded to their monetary strains. Dorian had been aiding our son, but he'd safeguarded matching or superior amounts for me, as if he'd foreseen that one day I'd need to fend independently. My device hummed with a message from Lamont. Mama, Camila located an agent to market the house. We can begin viewings next week. Hope you're advancing on a new spot. I eyed the note for a prolonged instant, then glanced anew at the bank docs on my lap. Lamont and Camila were so assured, so positive they controlled the game. They were clueless that their meticulous schemes rested on a base they misunderstood. Tomorrow, I'd contact the firm's bookkeeper. I'd uncover precisely what else Dorian had arranged, and then I'd determine how to wield the insight that my husband had cherished me sufficiently to assure I'd never depend on another's whim. The morning persisted, as raw and piercing as before, but beneath it, another element burgeoned. A subdued fortitude I hadn't sensed in Eras. The bookkeeping firm of Washington and Partners occupied a humble plaza slot between a laundromat and an insurance agency. I'd never visited prior. Dorian had perpetually conducted the corporate sessions alone, asserting it was dull forms that would merely induce a migraine. Now I grasped he'd been guarding me from beyond mere boredom. Alondra Washington appeared near my age, with salt and pepper twists secured in a functional knot and compassionate eyes behind slim frames. She'd overseen Monroe Building's ledgers for over 15 years, and her demeanor when I'd phoned the prior day had been prudently impartial. "Ms. Monroe," she uttered, motioning to a seat facing her jumbled desk. "First off, my sympathies. Dorian was a fine gentleman and a straightforward entrepreneur. I'll miss our seasonal reviews." "Thank you. I wish I could claim I knew him as thoroughly in commerce as you." I settled in, my fresh bank papers stowed securely in my bag. "I'm aiming to fathom our financial state, and the bank cited continuing corporate earnings I was unaware of." Alondra's brows arched mildly. "Unaware? That's atypical. Dorian referenced you frequently, and I presumed—" She faded, apparently rethinking her phrasing. "Please, I must comprehend what's transpired. My son states the enterprise was liquidated years back and hardly offset its liabilities." "Liquidated?" Alondra seemed truly perplexed. "Ms. Monroe, Monroe Building wasn't liquidated, it was reorganized." She swiveled to her system, loading documents. 5 years ago, Dorian shifted ownership of the assets into a trust. The Monroe Building Trust. You're the chief recipient. The space appeared to sway a tad. "I'm the proprietor of the building firm?" "Well, the trust holds it. And you hold the trust. It's thrived, in fact. Your husband was judicious about post-reorg contracts, modest tasks, dependable patrons, consistent earnings over the ups and downs of bigger ventures." She outputted pages and proffered them. "These are the income statements for the last 5 years. As evident, the firm has yielded steady proceeds." I gaped at the figures, my hands quivering faintly. The yearly gains were hefty, more than adequate to account for the routine deposits I'd observed in the trust reports. "But Dorian stepped away," I said faintly. "He ceased laboring." "He withdrew from routine ops, yes, but retained supervision and guided major choices. The hands-on work has been led by Javante Harris. I reckon you're acquainted." I affirmed. Javante had labored for Dorian over 20 years, commencing as a novice trainee and ascending to supervisor. He'd attended the service among the few genuinely distraught. "Javante has basically steered the firm for 5 years, Alondra went on. "Dorian arranged for Javante to earn a profit share as incentive, keeping him driven and devoted. It's proven highly effective." "Why did Dorian conceal all this?" The query emerged as scarcely audible. Alondra faltered, evidently uneasy. "Ms. Monroe, this may overstep, but Dorian fretted over familial strains. He noted your son faced money troubles and his spouse had lavish preferences. Dorian feared that if kin learned of the ongoing corporate revenue, demands might arise that could jeopardize your long-term safety." The fragments aligned with crushing precision. Each occasion Lamont solicited his dad for funds. Each time Camilla remarked on our apparent comfort, Dorian had been strategizing aid for our son without forfeiting my future self-reliance. "He was shielding me," I voiced, the terms laden with epiphany. "He was shielding you both differently," Alondra replied tenderly. "The advances to Lamont across years were sizable, but sourced from ops funds, not personal holdings, and he meticulously recorded all." She extracted another dossier. "These duplicate all loan packs between the firm and your son. Dorian demanded formal handling with timelines and rates." I flipped the folder with unsteady grip. Sheet upon sheet of agreements, each endorsed by Dorian and Lamont. The totals stunned, tens of thousands across 5 years, ostensibly for Lamont's assorted ventures and stakes. "Has Lamont repaid these?" I probed, suspecting the reply. Alondra's look grew awkward. "The ledger indicates major delinquencies. As of last month, the due balance plus interest nears $87,000. The figure slammed me like a strike. Lamont owed the family enterprise, my enterprise, almost $90,000, while concurrently asserting his dad left naught but debts. "What of these loan duties now?" I asked. "They convey with the assets. As trust holder, you hold legal sway to seek repayment or revise conditions as desired." I pondered Lamont and Camilla appraising my kitchen, plotting their overhauls, debating listing timelines. They were so self-assured, so convinced they merited all Dorian constructed. "One further detail," Alondra said, her voice more circumspect. "Last month, your son reached me outright. He stated with his dad's demise, he'd assume business oversight. He requested ownership shift papers, and I informed him I'd need beneficiary approval from you. He appeared shocked you were entwined in the setup whatsoever. Thus, Lamont had schemed to seize the firm beside the home, presuming I was too bereaved and uninformed to notice. The disloyalty pierced deeper than imagined. Alondra, I must pose something private, I said. If I wish to preserve the existing setup with Javante leading ops, is that viable? Definitely. Javante has awaited your contact. He's anxious about the firm's path and his role. If you uphold the current, he'd prove dependable and appreciative. I amassed the documents, my intellect swirling with consequences. The firm was mine. Lamont's amassed debt was tangible and enforceable, and neither he nor Camila suspected their scheme stood on deceit and presumptions. I'd like to arrange a session with Javante promptly, I stated, and I want to grasp all options on the unpaid loans. Naturally, should I ring Javante this afternoon? Yes, kindly. And Alondra, I'd value discretion on this talk for now. Utterly. Client privacy is paramount here. As I motored home, my phone vibrated with a text from Camila. Latrice, the agent seeks a shooter for tomorrow. Ensure the place is tidy and cleared. Initial views count for prospects. I regarded the note lengthy before stowing my device sans reply. Let them orchestrate their shoot. Let them envision their tomorrow in my abode, expending funds they fancied inherited. They were oblivious that the bedrock of their aspirations was poised to shatter below. That night, I sat in Dorian's den for the first time post his passing, encircled by his orderly archives. Now I comprehended his precision in records, why he demanded documentation for each deal. He'd erected a bulwark around me, layer by layer, exchange by exchange, and tomorrow I'd commence discovering the true resilience of those barriers. Javante Harris's roughened hands cradled his coffee cup as we convened in my kitchen the following morn. At 55, he retained the sturdy build and toughened palms of a lifelong builder, but his eyes bore a fatigue I'd never noted. Ms. Monroe, truth be told, he said, his timbre gruff with feeling. I've been fretting nonstop since Mr. Dorian went. Lamont swung by the site last week, yapping about asset reviews and efficiency tweaks. Didn't bode well for types like me. I refilled my tea, employing the habitual act to calm my jitters. Javante, what did my son precisely convey? He mentioned the family hit rough patches financially, that hard calls loomed for the business. He demanded a full roster of ongoing deals, gear, and revenue forecasts. Javante's jaw clenched. He also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the office. And what did you tell him? That I'd need to talk to whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. Dorian always told me that if anything happened to him, I should wait for proper instruction from the legal owner. Javante met my eyes. He never said it would be Lamont. Relief flooded through me. Dorian had prepared for this scenario, ensuring that Javante would be a guardian of the business rather than simply handing it over to anyone who claimed authority. Javante, I need to share something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us for now. His expression grew serious. You have it, ma'am. I spread out the documents Alondra had given me the day before. I own Monroe Building, not Lamont. Not the estate, me. Dorian transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago, and I'm the beneficiary. Javante's eyes widened as he studied the papers. Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. Dorian was always thinking 3 steps ahead. He was indeed, and according to these records, the business has been quite profitable under your management. A flush of pride crossed Javante's features. We've built a good reputation, Miss Monroe. Steady clients, quality work, fair prices. Mr. Dorian taught me that repeat customers are worth more than any single big score. I want you to continue exactly as you have been, Afsane, I said. But I need to understand something. Lamont has been less than honest about the family's financial situation. Can you tell me about any interactions you've had with him regarding business matters? Javante's expression darkened. There have been several over the years. He'd come around when Mr. Dorian wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know about upcoming payments from clients. A couple times he suggested that maybe the business could help him out with some temporary funding for investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he'd need to talk to his father. I'm not stupid, Miss Monroe. I could see what was happening. Javante's voice grew harder. Last year, he actually showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a big payment from the Washington office building project. Just coincidence, he said, but he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about the deposit. My stomach clenched. Lamont had been monitoring the business income, probably trying to time his requests for loans to coincide with maximum available cash. Javante, I want to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Do you think Lamont understands how much money has been flowing through this business? Javante was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think he knows it's more than your family let on, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. Dorian was very careful about keeping business and personal finances separate, at least on paper. What do you mean? Well, your husband was smart about it. When Lamont would ask for help, Mr. Dorian would tell him the business was struggling, that margins were tight, but then he'd find a way to help anyway, usually as a loan from the business account rather than from his personal funds. Javante pulled out his own small notebook, worn from years of use. I keep track of everything, Miss Monroe. It's a habit Mr. Dorian taught me. According to my records, Lamont has received payments totaling about $93,000 over the past 5 years. The number was even higher than what Alondra had shown me. Payments, not loans? That's what I mean about Mr. Dorian being smart. He'd structure them as loans on paper with payment schedules and everything, but he never actually enforced the payment terms. Lamont would miss a payment, and Mr. Dorian would just let it slide. So Lamont thinks he owes nothing. Lamont acts like he owes nothing, Javante corrected. Whether he really believes it or just pretends to believe it, I can't say. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Lamont's SUV parked behind Javante's work truck. That's my son, I said quietly. I don't want him to know we've been talking about business matters. Javante nodded and quickly gathered up the papers I'd shown him. Ms. Monroe, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support. Mr. Dorian was a good man, and he trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me. Lamont walked in without knocking, something that would have irritated Dorian, but which I'd learned to accept over the years. Morning, Mama, he said, barely glancing at Javante. I wasn't expecting company. Javante stopped by to check on me, I said smoothly. You know how thoughtful he's always been. Right. Lamont's attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the kitchen as if evaluating it for resale. Actually, Javante, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation. Javante's expression became carefully neutral. Oh? With Dad gone, there are going to be some changes. The family needs to make some practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations. I watched this exchange with fascination. Lamont was so confident, so certain of his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that had never belonged to him. What kind of changes? Javante asked. Well, we'll need to evaluate whether it makes sense to continue operations or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts. Lamont's tone was casual, as if he were discussing what to have for lunch. I see. And who's making these decisions? Lamont blinked, clearly not expecting the question. The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward. Will you now? Javante's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight emphasis on you. Mama, you might want to make some fresh tea, Lamont said, dismissing me as he always had when important conversations were taking place. Javante and I need to discuss some technical details. But I didn't move. For the first time in years, I stood my ground. I'll stay, thank you. This is my kitchen, and Javante is my guest. Lamont looked surprised but shrugged. Fine. Javante, I'll need you to prepare a complete inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts so I can assess the financial situation. I'd be happy to help with that, Javante said carefully. Who should I coordinate with regarding authorization for account access? With me, obviously. And you have the legal authority to access Monroe Building accounts? Because Lamont's confidence wavered slightly. Because I'm Dorian Monroe's son and heir. I see. And do you have documentation showing that you're authorized to act on behalf of the business? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Lamont's face was reddening, and I could see him struggling between irritation and uncertainty. Look, Javante, I don't think you understand the situation here, Lamont said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when he felt challenged. This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and make sure everyone gets taken care of, but I can't do that if you're going to make things difficult. I'm not trying to make things difficult, Javante replied evenly. I'm just trying to understand who I'm supposed to be taking orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures and documentation. Lamont turned to me, clearly expecting support. Mama, explain to Javante that I'm handling Dad's business matters now. I looked at my son, this man who was planning to sell my house out from under me, who had accumulated nearly $90,000 in debt while claiming his father left nothing behind, and made my choice. Actually, Lamont, I think Javante is right to ask for proper documentation, I said quietly. Your father was always very careful about these things. Lamont stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. What are you talking about? I'm talking about making sure everything is handled properly and legally. Surely you can understand the importance of that. For the first time since this conversation began, Lamont looked uncertain, and watching that uncertainty creep across his features, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. The phone call came at 7th hour in the morning, 3 days after my confrontation with Lamont in the kitchen. I'd been expecting it. You can't question someone's assumed authority without consequences, especially when that someone is used to getting his way. Mama, we need to talk now. Lamont's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Camila and I are coming over. It's rather early, don't you think? This can't wait. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before I could respond. I took my time getting dressed, choosing a deep burgundy dress that Dorian had always said made me look dignified. If this was going to be a confrontation, I intended to face it properly. They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Camila's heels clicking aggressively on the front porch. I opened the door before they could knock, maintaining the small advantage of being the hostess in my own home. Good morning, I said pleasantly, as if this were a social visit. Camila pushed past me into the living room, her designer purse clutched like a weapon. Lamont followed, his face grim. They both remained standing, positioning themselves between me and the door, in what I recognized as an intimidation tactic. Mama, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Lamont began. But Javante Harris called yesterday and said he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization. What did you tell him? I settled into Dorian's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that. Proper procedures? Camila's voice was shrill. Lamont is Dorian's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need? Legal authorization, I said calmly. The kind that comes with actual ownership. Lamont's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I handle all the assets until probate is settled. Actually, Lamont, that's not quite accurate. I reached for the folder I'd placed on the side table, the one containing all the documents Alondra Washington had given me. Lamont and Camila both tensed as I opened it. Your father's will does indeed leave his personal possessions and this house to the family, I continued, but Monroe Building isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 5 years. What are you talking about? Lamont demanded. I pulled out the trust documents and set them on the coffee table between us. Monroe Building has been owned by the Monroe Building Trust since 2019. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. The silence that followed was deafening. Camila reached for the documents first, her manicured fingers shaking as she scanned the legal language. Lamont read over her shoulder, his face growing pale. This is impossible, Camila whispered. You don't know anything about business. You never even balanced a checkbook. You're right, I didn't. Your father handled all of that, but apparently he understood things about our family situation that I was too naive to see. Lamont sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. But the business was struggling. Dad always said margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep operations running. The business has been quite profitable, actually. Here are the financial statements for the past 5 years. I handed him another set of papers. Watching Lamont's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. These profits... Lamont's voice was barely audible. Where did this money go? Some of it went to you, Lamont. Quite a lot of it, actually. I pulled out the loan documentation, $87,000 over 5 years to be precise. Camila grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. These say loans. Lamont, you told me those were gifts. You said your father was helping us get established. They were gifts, Lamont said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad never asked for payments. He never even mentioned payment schedules. Actually, he did, I said quietly. Alondra Washington has copies of every conversation, every missed payment, every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed. I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Lamont had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments based on money he thought was his. But this doesn't change anything, Camila said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. The house still goes to Lamont. That's worth more than some little construction business. Is it? I asked mildly. Camila's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. Don't play games, Latrice. This house is worth at least $400,000. You're right, it's a lovely property. Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage. Lamont looked up sharply. What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off. It was, but 18 months ago your father took out a home equity loan. Quite a substantial one, actually. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I discovered in Dorian's study just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked emergency funds. A home equity loan for $350,000, I continued. The proceeds were transferred into the Monroe Building Trust account, which means they became part of my inheritance. Camila's face went white. That's not possible. We would have known. We would have had to sign. Your father was the sole owner of the house at the time, McDowell, I interrupted. I was listed as a spouse with rights of survivorship, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature. Lamont stared at the loan documents like they were written in a foreign language. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage the house just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this conversation began, I allowed my carefully controlled emotions to show. Because he was protecting me, Lamont. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security. Protecting you from what? Lamont's voice was hoarse. From this, I said, gesturing to the scene in front of me. From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved. Camila's composure finally cracked completely. You manipulated him. You convinced a dying man to change everything. Your father wasn't dying when he set up these trusts, Camila. He was planning, and the fact that he felt the need to plan for this scenario should tell you something about how he viewed our family dynamics. Lamont's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mama, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a construction business, and the house? This house is our family home. It should stay in the family. It is staying in the family, Lamont. It's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Camila said desperately. How will you afford the mortgage payments? The same way your father intended, with income from Monroe Building. Javante Harris assures me the business is quite stable, and Alondra Washington says the cash flow will easily cover the loan payments with plenty left over for my living expenses. I stood up, smoothing my dress. Now, I believe you mentioned something about moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Lamont looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Mama, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family means. Your father did do everything for me, I interrupted. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own son's, and now I understand just how much I needed that protection. Camila was already at the door, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, Latrice. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. But you should know that everything your father did was completely legal and properly documented. Alondra Washington is very thorough, and she's already provided copies of all relevant documents to my attorney. Lamont paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. I don't understand, Mama. Why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you, Lamont. I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me. After they left, I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my house, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was completely financially independent. I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what I had. Dorian had given me more than money. He'd given me freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Pacific. The sound of waves against the rocks below had become my daily symphony, replacing the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house. The cottage in Mendocino was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every room reflected my taste rather than compromises made over 32 years of marriage. I discovered, to my surprise, that I had excellent taste when nobody else was offering opinions. Monroe Building continued to thrive under Javante Harris's management. He called every Friday afternoon to update me on current projects and upcoming contracts, and quarterly profits were deposited directly into my account. I'd kept my promise to maintain the business exactly as Dorian had structured it, and everyone involved seemed happier for the stability. I'd kept the old house for a while, renting it out to cover expenses, but eventually sold it on my terms, using the proceeds to fund this seaside retreat. The cottage had been an unexpected discovery. While researching properties in coastal California, I'd learned that Dorian had purchased it 3 years ago through the construction trust. Alondra Washington had found the deed while organizing business assets, along with a note in Dorian's handwriting, for Latrice's retirement when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Even in death, my husband was still taking care of me. This morning was special, though. My lawyer was coming by to finalize the last piece of business from my old life. Lamont and Camila had indeed tried to contest the trust arrangements, hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases. It hadn't gone well for them. The investigation had revealed that not only were all of Dorian's financial arrangements completely legal and properly executed, but Lamont's debt to the business was actually larger than anyone had initially calculated. Interest and penalties brought the total to just over $96,000. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 hours. Eddie Thompson was a precise man who believed punctuality reflected character. He'd been representing me since this whole mess began, and his calm competence had been invaluable during the more stressful moments. "Good morning, Latrice," he said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window that had become his usual spot during our meetings. "I have the final settlement agreement for your review." I poured coffee from the French press I'd learned to use, another small freedom in my new life, and sat across from him. "How did they take the final terms?" Eddie's expression suggested controlled amusement, about as well as you'd expect. Lamont's attorney spent considerable time arguing that family obligations should supersede business contracts, but ultimately the law is quite clear on debt obligations. He handed me the settlement documents. After 6 months of legal wrangling, Lamont and Camila had agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt and established a payment plan that would take them 8 years to complete, assuming they never missed a payment. "They tried once more to negotiate a family forgiveness clause," Eddie continued. "Lamont actually broke down in the final meeting, claiming that you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money." "And what did you tell them?" "I reminded them that I was representing your financial interests, not your family relationships, though I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect legitimate debts. The settlement also included a provision that particularly satisfied me. If Lamont and Camila defaulted on payments, the business could legally garnish Lamont's wages and place liens on any property they purchased. It was a safety net that would ensure I received what was owed, regardless of their future financial decisions. "There's one more thing," Eddie said, pulling out a separate envelope. "This arrived for you yesterday." The envelope was addressed in Lamont's familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note on plain paper. "Mama, I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you on this, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was doing. It took losing almost everything for me to see how much I'd taken for granted. Camila and I are getting marriage counseling, and I'm working 2 jobs to meet the payment schedule. I'm hoping that someday you might be willing to talk to me again. I'm sorry for everything. Lamont." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The apology was genuine, I could tell, but it was also 6 months too late and motivated by consequences rather than conscience. "Any response you'd like me to convey?" Eddie asked. "No. If Lamont wants to rebuild a relationship with me, he can do it the same way he'll pay off his debt, gradually, consistently, and over time." After Eddie left, I took my coffee out to the deck and read Lamont's letter again. The grief was still there, not just for Dorian, but for the son I'd thought I'd raised and the family relationships I'd believed were real. But underneath the sadness was something stronger, a deep satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. "Hello? Ms. Monroe? This is Shauna Washington, Alondra's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling. I did remember Shauna, a nurse who worked at the regional hospital. Alondra had mentioned her occasionally during our meetings. Of course not, dear. How can I help you? Well, it's actually how you might help us. Mom told me about your situation, about how you had to rebuild your life after family difficulties. I'm starting a support group for women who've had to deal with financial manipulation by family members, and I wondered if you might be willing to share your experience. The request caught me off guard. I'm not sure I'd know what to say. You'd be surprised how many women find themselves in similar situations. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets, spouses who hide financial information, family members who mistake kindness for weakness. Your story could help other women understand their rights and find the courage to protect themselves. I thought about this for a moment, watching a pelican dive for the fish in the bay below. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow facing homelessness at the hands of my own son. Today, I was financially independent, living exactly where I wanted to live, accountable to no one but myself. When would you like me to speak? I asked. Really? You'll do it? I think I will, but not about revenge or legal battles. I want to talk about the difference between being a loving family member and being a doormat, about the importance of understanding your own financial situation, about the gift Dorian gave me when he protected my future, even from our own son. We scheduled the speaking engagement for the following month. After hanging up, I realized that helping other women navigate similar situations felt like a purpose, a way to honor both Dorian's protection and my own hard-won independence. That evening, I did something I'd started doing every night since moving to the cottage. I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, taking time to appreciate the simple fact that this view, this peace, this freedom was entirely mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could vote me out of my own life. No one could decide I was disposable. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean's rhythm and the distant call of seabirds settling in for the night. Tomorrow, I would tend to my garden, maybe drive into town for lunch at the little bistro where the owner always saved me the table by the window. Simple pleasures that belonged entirely to me. Lamont's debt would be paid eventually, whether he managed it responsibly or the business had to garnish his wages. The legal settlement ensured that justice would be served regardless of his choices. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd found the strength to demand the respect I deserved. As the last light faded from the sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Dorian wherever he was. He'd loved me enough to ensure I'd never be helpless, never be dependent on the mercy of people who saw me as expendable, and he'd loved me enough to make sure that when the test came, I'd have everything I needed to pass it. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and I sat in my own home, on my own deck, living my own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been mine by right. It meant peace. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.